Going to welcome now to the stage one of this year's nonfiction judges who is going to present the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Nonfiction Runner-up. He is an author, an editor. He is a composer, lyricist. I'm telling you, he's frightening. He's a record and television producer. He's the co-founder and president of Serious Thinking Limited. How do you spell serious? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's this S-I-R-I-U-S, Serious Thinking Limited. Amazing. An educational media production company. He has won 3 Emmys. I was nominated once. 3 Emmys, 2 Grammys for his musical contributions to Sesame Street. He was a senior editor at Random House, charter contributing editor of National Lampoon. In 1993, he became chairman of the Modern Libraries Board of Advisors, renewing his ties to Random House. Get a load of this now. His newest book is, did you all see this already? Are you actually reading the stuff that comes with, I hope you haven't heard this because it's priceless. His newest book is Encyclopedia Paranoiaca, an alphabetized, intensely cross-referenced guide to everyone and everything you should be afraid of or worried about. I want it. I've already ordered it. It's good. It's going to be published by Simon & Schuster November 20th. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Cerf is in the building. Terrified.
That was great. That was wonderful. I want to add that our book will be published November 20th only if the world doesn't end before that date. But anyway, thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. It's an incredible honor to be here, especially on Armistice Day. I'm glad that came up already because we actually have 2 books this time that relate to the horrors of World War I, and it seems very appropriate to be giving a peace award on the anniversary of the armistice. I also want to quickly say how grateful I am to Sharon Grab and Mark Meister for letting me be a judge, and to my friends Bob Fogarty and Catherine Kadish, who helped me get here, and my beloved Catherine Vaz, who was a judge several times, and I'm sure that had something to do with my luck in getting here. And of course, I also want to thank the committee who got the books to us that enabled us to read these wonderful books, and finally the authors themselves. I'm thrilled to be even associated this way with them, and I want to tell you about one in particular, Annia Ciezadlo. On the simplest level, her Day of Honey is an artfully crafted, precociously wise, always touching, and often hilarious memoir about an unlikely marriage. She describes herself in the book as a garrulous, food-obsessed, Polish, Greek, Scotch, Irish mutt from working-class Chicago who will eat anything, while her husband, Mohammed, is a quiet, Lebanese-born Shiite who, quote, refuses to consume, asparagus, artichokes, mushrooms, beets, anything cruciferous, pumpkin, not in the form of pie, duck, pork, fish of any kind, and anything else that emerges from the water, beef that hasn't been cooked to resemble linoleum, coffee, or beer. This is a partial list, she says. And on just the basis of their relationship, Day of Honey would be an impressive literary debut. But it's far, far more than that, which of course is why it's so worthy of this prize. It's more than a cross-cultural love story because Annia and Mohammed are war correspondents who honeymooned in Baghdad during the early days of the Iraq War and spent their next 6 years in Beirut, where they faced recurring sectarian street combat amongst a shifting array of militias, not to mention a period of intense bombing by the Israelis. And Ciezadlo was an astute observer with a ravenous appreciation of local culture, a sharp eye for human foibles, a matchless ear for dialogue, a great sense of irony, and an uncanny ability to convey the larger importance of virtually everything she encounters. In her hands, meals and their preparation become the basis for a portrait of daily life in the Middle East, more intimate and more profound than most foreigners will ever encounter. Also a lens through which we can view 4,000 years of Arabic history and mythology, something we all know too little about, and a metaphor for the ability of the human spirit to transcend the unimaginable stress, as she calls it, and hardship of war. The book's title is derived from an Arabic proverb, day of honey, day of onions. It means, Annia explains, some days will be good and others will be bad. And in her pages, we meet unforgettable characters who persevere through both. An Iraqi intellectual overwhelmed by the beauty of chicken soup for the soul, for example. A professional squeegee man of mourning who crashes funerals and keens until relatives of the deceased pay him to leave. A Beirut restaurateur who serves up fruit cocktails named after Hitler, Castro, Noriega, and Nelson Mandela. Anna's friend Lena, who hosts a dinner party in her Beirut bomb shelter. And most memorable of all, the author's indomitable mother-in-law, who when her furniture is stolen by rampaging Amal militiamen, thinks nothing about browbeating their leader in an attempt to get the furniture back. Auntie, they didn't know it was your house, he pleads, and in the face of her unrelenting onslaught, he offers a compromise. Her chairs and tables are long gone, but his men will happily steal someone else's and give the victims to her. But she declined, Annia writes. Most civilians experience war not as the fighters and victims, this is a quote from Annia, not as the fighters and victims that parade across television screens, but as tired housewives peeling potatoes and wondering all the while at the stupidity of it all. And so she concludes, this book is not about the ever-evolving ways in which people kill or die during wars, but about how they live before, during, and after those wars. It's about the millions of small ways people cope, about how they survive. So it's my great, great pleasure to be able to introduce you tonight, Annia Ciezadlo, who wrote this wonderful book. Thank you.
I can't, can y'all hear me? Okay, just like yell or wave your arms if you can't or something. I can't tell you what an honor and a thrill it is to be introduced by Mr. Cerf, who I grew up reading his dad's short story anthologies and apparently is involved with Sesame Street and Dr. Seuss. So basically, you're responsible, your family, and you are responsible for my entire childhood. So that's pretty cool. I want to thank everyone here in Dayton. It's been such an amazing Midwestern whirlwind of hospitality. I tell everybody that Midwestern hospitality rivals the Mideastern hospitality. It's been amazing. And thank you, Sharon, Mark, and Kathleen, and millions of other people that I've met this weekend, whose names I can't remember, and would take too long to go through. And I wanted to thank everyone at Free Press, my publisher, who were so good to me and believed in this book for the many years that it took me to write. The 3 years that it took me to write, which was 2 years longer than my contract said I should write it in, especially because they all just got laid off. So unfortunate thing that's happening in the publishing industry. So I want to thank them because they were so good and they believed in this book for so long. So I'd like to thank them. And also just everyone in Beirut and Baghdad and New York who helped me, and I thank them all in the book, and that's one of the reasons why it's so long. I had a whole speech that I was going to give, and it was about love and war and how we fall in love with war in the same way that we fall in love with the wrong people, just very irrationally, almost a form of temporary insanity. And we say we're not going to do it again, and yet we do. And this behavior can be true of entire societies as it is on the individual level. But you know what? I'm not going to give that speech. I scrapped it, and here's why. Last night, somebody asked us a question, and I think Marlon might have also been referring to, there were actually a couple of very many interesting questions last night. Somebody asked us a question last night, and I've been thinking about it ever since. It's a very old question. We've all heard it before, and it's never really been answered. It was simply this question: we all believe that war is bad. You're not going to find someone who's going to tell you, you know, war is really great. I really like it. It's really cool. I think we should do more of it. And you will be hard-pressed to find people who will say that it's good, and yet we keep doing it. We keep saying that it's necessary over and over again. So is this something that we're simply predisposed to do? Are we made to do this the way that a saber-toothed tiger is made to kill and eat gazelles? Are we hardwired? Are we designed for this? And the way he said it, I thought was interesting. He said, you know, is this just the way these people are? Which I thought was interesting, because we always think it's always someone else who starts it, right? And we just have to come in and fix it, because we're good, you know, we're gonna fix it by coming in and joining in. And it made me think about my own career, particularly before I wrote this book, which was as a journalist and covering the Iraq War, which is actually something that I love doing. And I loved being a war correspondent, but one of the drawbacks to that, which is, you know, a big occupational hazard, particularly covering a war like the Iraq War, you are constantly selling stories about war. And particularly as a freelancer, you're really hustling, you're really selling. And this means that you, on some level, are selling war, or at least that's what you worry. That's something that you think about. It's kind of constantly haunting you. If I'm selling stories about war, am I helping to sell war? I'll give you an example. Back in 2005, I wrote a magazine profile of a human rights lawyer and a democracy activist in Beirut who was running this guerrilla presidential campaign. And he was using social media, and he was doing all kinds of really cool stuff. He'd gone to the local transparency sort of anti-corruption NGO, and he'd actually voluntarily said, can you monitor my campaign finances? I mean, imagine a politician anywhere doing this. It was unheard of in Lebanon. It would be unheard of here. And it was exactly the kind of creative and provocative and intelligent activism that we never really get to hear about in the US, or only rarely get to hear about. And this was a risky thing, by the way. Activists like him were getting assassinated right and left in those days. And so I thought he'd be a really cool subject for a profile. And he had been a member of the sort of, he was a fascinating figure to me because he was an anti-war activist, but also a war activist. He had been very much a proponent of the Iraq War because he had been you know, a big supporter of the Kurdish independence movement and a big supporter of the anti-Saddam movement for very, very many years, going back to the time when the United States was a big supporter of Saddam. So he was a fascinating character for that reason. He was a really, really fascinating character, of a sort of an anti-war warmonger. And I thought it was really interesting that he was running this presidential campaign. I thought readers like you would be interested in reading about him. So I convinced this magazine to assign a profile of him, and I wrote it, and they ended up killing it because he wasn't important enough. Not that I'm bitter. And they emailed me and they said, you know, sorry, it's he's really interesting, but he's just not important. He's not a player. And they asked me to do yet another article about Hezbollah instead. And this is the kind of decision that editors make every day. This is what shapes what you all get to read. So I was complaining to a friend of mine about this, another journalist, and she laughed and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, look, the problem with him is he hasn't killed anybody. Let him kill a few people, just one or two, nothing fancy, you know, and they'll be interested. And we both laughed kind of, you know, cynically, but she was right. And we both knew she was right. You can always sell a story about a militia leader or a soldier, or better yet, a general. I mean, everyone wants to read about a general. How often do you hear about a human rights lawyer or an interview with a disaster relief specialist, a Q&A with a hunger striker or a refugee? You hear those stories, but they're very rare, very, very rare. One of the most fascinating stories I ever did was about a guy who ran away from a war. He was an Iraqi, and he became a refugee because the guys in his village wanted him to join the Mahdi army, and he didn't really feel like joining the Mahdi army that day or any day. So after a couple weeks of pressure, they came to his house and they shot him. And a huge exit wound. I mean, he almost died. So he ended up going to Lebanon and becoming a refugee. He risked death in order not to participate in a war. What kind of courage does that take? I mean, my God, courage to not be in a war. We don't really hear so much about that. And I met dozens of guys like him in Iraq and in Lebanon. People who simply refused, who said no. People who were beaten, shot, kidnapped, and worse because they refused to be a part of a war. There were thousands of guys like that. There are thousands of guys like that in every war zone, guys and women. Refugee camps are full of people like this, people who have that kind of individual courage. And you hardly ever hear their stories. They're very hard for people like me to sell, and they're consequently harder for people like you to read. And I believe that you guys actually want to read those stories. I do think that you want to hear those stories. And this gets back to that guy's question from last night. I can't really answer the fundamental question about human nature, like whether we're inherently violent or not. It's above my pay grade. But I do know this, and I said this last night, and I'll say it again. War is something that has to be taught. It has to be very methodically and systematically taught. Violence, yeah, we all have that in us. Even me, even you. But war is different. War is not simply violence. War is very methodical. It takes a long time to build. It can break out in an instant, but the preparation has usually lasted for months. And many people participate in this teaching and this preparation. And I think that if we can teach it, this should seem obvious, right? Then we can unteach it. If we can learn it, we can if we can learn it, we can unlearn it. We have books that teach war. We have Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, training manuals. We have a great machine and system for teaching war, and even the media is part of it. I'm part of it as part of the media. But we also have all these books that unteach it, right? That teach us about avoiding it or stopping it. And that's why I'm so grateful for this prize. I'm grateful just that it exists, because we, writers, authors, journalists, we don't necessarily get that much encouragement for the unteaching of war. It's important to remember writing about the war against war. This is part of writing about war as well. The stories are out there. There are, like I said, thousands of people out there, not just in the Middle East, but from places from Africa to Afghanistan. People are fighting against war every day. I do think that you readers love to hear those stories, and I love telling them. I can't claim that I've stopped any bullets with my book, although it's certainly thick enough, probably. I don't know if we're stopping any wars just by being here. No, we're not starting one, at least not while we're here. That's nothing to sneer at. And I think that that's something that we can learn by example. We can learn from stories of people like this. These people like these Iraqis that I'm talking about, people like I said, refugee camps are full of. And if we can learn about people who had the bravery to risk their lives to avoid a war, maybe that will help us answer this question. Is this the way we are? Yeah, it is part of the way we are. We do keep having wars. But it's also in our nature to disobey, to say no. What is it, Oscar Wilde, I think, said, disobedience is man's original virtue. It is in our nature to say no. No, screw this, I'm not gonna do it. Sorry, you can shoot me, you can kick me, you can burn me, you can beat me, but I am not gonna do this. This is wrong, this is bad. And I applaud that spirit, and I thank you again for this prize. Thanks.